You're not entirely human. That sentence sounds wrong. It sounds like the opening of a science fiction story or a philosophical provocation designed to unsettle rather than inform. But it is, in the most precise and literal biological sense, true. Inside every cell of your body, wound into the double helix of your genome, there are stretches of DNA that did not come from Homo sapiens. They came from something else, something older, something that walked this earth for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans arrived, that lived and hunted and raised children and buried its dead in ways we are only beginning to understand, and that, in moments of encounter that happened tens of thousands of years ago in landscapes now covered by cities and farms and deserts, left its genetic signature inside the lineage that would eventually produce you. And the strangest part of this story is not that those encounters happened. It is what scientists have found when they looked at the DNA those encounters left behind, because some of the genetic material in your cells does not match any known species. Some of it belongs to people, if we can call them that, who have left no bones, no tools, no cave art, no trace in the fossil record whatsoever. They are known only as shadows in your genome. Scientists call them ghost populations, and they may be the most important discovery in the history of human evolutionary biology. The story of how we know this begins with a fragment of bone small enough to hold between two fingers. In 2008, researchers working in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a region of Russia where the mountains meet the steppe and the winters last most of the year, extracted a tiny piece of a finger bone from among thousands of other fragments, accumulated on the cave floor over hundreds of thousands of years. The bone was unremarkable to look at. It was the distal phalanx of a little finger, probably from a child, and it was so small and so fragmentary that it would have been easy to overlook. But the team preserved it, and in 2010, they extracted DNA from it and sequenced the genome. What they found electrified the scientific community worldwide. The genome did not belong to a Neanderthal, whose DNA profile researchers already knew from earlier work, and it did not belong to a modern human. It belonged to something entirely new, a previously unknown population of archaic humans who had never appeared in any fossil collection, never been described in any taxonomy, never been suspected to exist until that moment. The researchers named them after the cave, Denisovans. For 15 years after that discovery, the Denisovans were the most mysterious people in human history. Scientists knew their genome in extraordinary detail, and that they had subsequently ranged across an enormous swath of Asia, from Siberia to the islands of Southeast Asia. They could tell all of this from DNA alone, because for 15 years that DNA was essentially all they had. A handful of teeth, a jaw fragment found in Tibet, a finger bone, a few scattered fragments, no skull, no face, no complete picture of what these people looked like, how large they were, how they moved through the world. The Denisovans were, in the truest sense, a people known only through their genes, that changed in June 2025, in a discovery that researchers described as one of the most significant in the history of paleoanthropology. The Dragon Man's skull, a massive, almost perfectly preserved cranium found by a construction worker near the Songhua River in Harbin, China in 1933, hidden at the bottom of a well for decades by a man who feared it might fall into Japanese hands during the occupation, recovered by his family in 2018 and handed to scientists, finally yielded its secret. 2 studies published simultaneously in the journals Science and Cell identified the Dragon Man's skull as the first nearly complete cranial fossil of a Denisovan. The identification came through an unexpected source, dental calculus, the hardened plaques, that accumulates on teeth over a lifetime, which had preserved ancient proteins and genetic material for 146,000 years. A team led by geneticist Qiaomei Fu of the Chinese Academy of Sciences extracted mitochondrial DNA from that dental tartar, not from the bone itself, which had not yielded viable DNA, and found a clear genetic link to the Denisovans, who had lived in Denisova Cave more than 100,000 years ago. The Dragon Man's skull is enormous. Its brow ridge is massive, its nasal aperture broad, its eye sockets wide and deep, its brain case long and large, a face that would have been striking and imposing, not quite like anything in the modern human range of variation, but clearly belonging to a being whose intelligence and capacity were in the same territory as our own. The confirmation that this skull belonged to a Denisovan expanded the known range of the species dramatically, from a single cave in Siberia across the vast breadth of East Asia, and gave the field its first opportunity to study the full physical profile of a people previously known only through fragments and genomes. After 15 years of knowing the Denisovans by their DNA alone, scientists finally had a face to go with the name. But the Denisovans, remarkable as they are not the strangest inhabitants of the human genome. They are merely the most recently identified. The truly disturbing discovery, the one that has reshaped the entire field of paleoanthropology and turned our understanding of human evolution into something far stranger and more complex than any textbook prepared us for, is what scientists found when they looked past the Denisovans and the Neanderthals, deeper into the genetic record, into the oldest and most cryptic layers of the DNA that modern humans carry. What they found there were signals from people who have never been identified, never been named, and never left a single bone that science has recovered. Populations that seem to have existed for hundreds of thousands of years, that interbred with our ancestors and left genetic material in our genomes, and that simply have no presence anywhere in the physical fossil record. They are, in the technical language of population genetics, ghost populations. And the more carefully researchers look, the more ghosts they find. The first serious evidence for ghost populations in modern human DNA came from a series of studies that accumulated across the 2010s and crystallized into something undeniable by 2020. Researchers at the University of Adelaide, led by Dr. João Teixeira, published a comprehensive analysis of the genetic signatures present in the DNA of populations from Southeast Asia, Papua New Guinea, and the islands of the Pacific, populations that, because of their geographic location, had been among the last to arrive in their homelands and had passed through or settled regions of Southeast Asian Asia, where archaic human populations had persisted long after they had disappeared elsewhere. The analysis identified signatures in the DNA of these modern populations that could not be explained by Neanderthal or Denisovan ancestry alone. There were at least 2 additional groups, the researchers concluded, whose DNA was present in these genomes, but who corresponded to no known archaic human population. One of them, designated EH1, appeared to have been roughly genetically equidistant from both Neanderthals and Denisovans, a separate lineage that had diverged from the common ancestor of those 2 groups, or possibly even earlier. The other appeared to have been even more divergent, genetically as different from modern humans as Denisovans are, but showing up only in the DNA of people from Flores, Indonesia, the island where the small-bodied archaic humans called Homo floresiensis had lived until surprisingly recently in geological terms. Dr. Teixeira described the implications in terms that have stayed with researchers ever since. Each of us carries within ourselves the genetic traces of these past mixing events, he said. These archaic groups were widespread and genetically diverse, and they survive in each of us. Their story is an integral part of how we came to be. That statement is worth sitting with for a moment. The ghost populations are not a curiosity from the distant edges of human evolution. They are inside us. Their DNA is doing things in our bodies right now, influencing traits, regulating genes, shaping the biology of people alive today who have no idea they carry the genetic inheritance of a people with no name and no face in the fossil record. But the ghost population story does not stop in Southeast Asia. Some of the most disturbing findings have come from the opposite end of the world, from the populations of West Africa, whose ancestral history was long assumed to be the simplest and most continuous in the human family, the deep African root from which all other populations eventually branched. A 2020 study published in Science Advances and conducted by Arun Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman of UCLA found that the genomes of West African populations, specifically the Yoruba and the Mende, 2 populations whose ancestry is deeply rooted in West Africa and who carry essentially no Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA, nevertheless showed genetic signatures that could not be explained by any known human population. Somewhere between 2 and 19% of the genetic diversity in these populations, the study found, appeared to derive from an archaic hominin that had diverged from the ancestors of modern humans before Neanderthals split from our lineage, before Neanderthals. Which means this ghost population was an independent human lineage for at least as long as the entire span from when Neanderthals first diverged from us to the present day, potentially for 600,000 years or more. This finding broke something in the simple narrative of human evolution. For decades, the story had been told as follows. Modern humans evolved in Africa. At some point, roughly 50 to 60,000 years ago, a population left Africa and spread across Eurasia, encountering Neanderthals and Denisovans along the way, interbreeding with them and then replacing them. The African populations who stayed behind were understood to be the continuous, uninterrupted human baseline, the people whose DNA was most purely Homo sapiens, uncontaminated by the archaic admixture that had complicated the genomes of their relatives who left. The West African ghost population finding upended that story completely. Africa was not a place of simple continuity. Africa was, as the largest and most ancient human habitat on Earth, a place of complexity, a continent where multiple human lineages had coexisted, overlapped, and interbred for hundreds of thousands of years, leaving a layered genetic record that modern genomics is only just beginning to read. The Denisovans themselves, it turns out, were carrying ghost population DNA of their own. When the Denisovan genomes were analyzed in detail, researchers found that approximately 4% of the Denisovan genome appeared to come from a population that had diverged from modern humans over 1 million years ago. 1 million years. The Denisovans, who were already archaic by our standards, had interbred with something even more archaic, something even further back in the human family tree, something that had been separately evolving for a time span that dwarfs the entire history of modern Homo sapiens on Earth. This super-archaic population, as researchers began to call it, has no name, no associated fossil, no identity beyond the statistical shadow it leaves in the genomes of a group of people who are themselves known primarily from a single cave in Siberia. It is a ghost inside a ghost. The Dragon Man skull, when it was finally identified as Denisovan in 2025, added another layer to this already bewildering picture. The genetic analysis of the Harbin cranium revealed that the individual's ancestors had not only interbred with early Neanderthals, as expected, but had also carried ancestry from one of these unknown super-archaic groups for which no ancient DNA match currently exists anywhere in that database. The researchers from the Smithsonian noted that traces of these same ghost lineages have been found in the DNA of modern humans as well. The ghosts are not isolated in the Denisovans. They passed through the Denisovans into us. To understand why this matters beyond mere evolutionary curiosity, you need to understand what the archaic DNA in modern human genomes is actually doing. For years after the initial discovery of Neanderthal DNA, in modern humans, researchers debated whether the archaic genetic material was functional or effectively neutral, whether it was doing anything, influencing anything, or whether it was simply genetic noise, the residue of ancient encounters that natural selection had neither amplified nor eliminated because it did not particularly matter either way. That debate has been settled, and the answer is that the archaic DNA matters enormously. A Cornell University study analyzed over 4,000 differences in DNA derived from Neanderthal ancestry and found that these variants are playing a substantial role in modern human biology, influencing at least 47 distinct genetic traits. The range of effects is striking. Some Neanderthal variants affect liver enzyme function, others influence the levels of receptors on immune cells. One region linked to Neanderthal ancestry has been associated with arthritis. Neanderthal DNA appears to have contributed to lighter skin and hair in populations of European ancestry, likely because the physical adaptations that Neanderthals had developed for living in low-light, cold Eurasian environments were useful for our ancestors when they arrived in the same environments. Neanderthal immune genes, representing the accumulated product of hundreds of thousands of years of exposure to Eurasian pathogens, gave our ancestors a ready-made set of immunological tools for the new environments they were entering. This is a profound point. Modern humans left Africa with an immune system calibrated for African pathogens. The Neanderthals they encountered in Europe and the Middle East had immune systems calibrated for European and Middle Eastern pathogens. The interbreeding that occurred between them was, in part, an immunological technology transfer, our ancestors acquiring, through sex rather than evolution, defenses that would have taken thousands of years to develop independently. One of the most striking examples of this immunological inheritance came in a study published in Science in August 2025. Researchers found that a gene called MUC19, involved in the production of proteins that form saliva and mucosal barriers in the respiratory and digestive tracts, had been inherited by indigenous peoples of the Americas from Denisovans, having passed through interbreeding events in Asia before the ancestors of the indigenous peoples crossed the Bering Strait. The frequency of this Denisovan gene variant in modern indigenous populations suggests that it was under significant natural selection, that it provided a measurable survival or reproductive advantage to the people who carried it, probably in the form of improved protection against respiratory pathogens in the new environments of the Americas. The Denisovans, who passed on this gene to the ancestors of the indigenous Americans, had been extinct for tens of thousands of years by the time those descendants crossed into the New World. But the gift of their biology traveled with the living, silently, generation by generation, across the ice of the Bering Strait and down through 2 continents, doing its molecular work in people who had no idea they carried it. The archaic DNA in modern humans is not only helpful. Neanderthal genetic variants have been associated with increased risk of depression, of blood clotting disorders, of certain immune conditions, of patterns of skin and hair that are useful in some environments and disadvantageous in others. A study found that Neanderthal DNA on chromosome 3, carried by 16% of Europeans and 50% of South Asians, was associated with an increased risk of severe illness after COVID-19 infection. A separate study found that different Neanderthal DNA on chromosome 12, carried by up to 50% of people in Eurasia and the Americas, appeared to reduce the risk of requiring intensive care after COVID-19 infection by roughly 22%. The same ancient inheritance from the same archaic people with protective effects in one genetic context and harmful effects in another, all of it mediated by the specific pathogen environment of the present day. Das, which is as different from the environment of 50,000 years ago as it is possible to imagine. The Neanderthals could not have known they were giving their descendants a tool that would matter in a respiratory pandemic in the 21st century, but that is what genetic inheritance means. That the decisions made in the bodies of our ancestors, the encounters they had, and the children they produced, shape the biology of people alive right now in ways that connect us to lives lived in caves and on ice sheets and in forests that no longer exist. What the ghost populations add to this picture is a dimension of depth that science is only beginning to probe. If the known archaic populations, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, whose DNA we can sequence and compare against the fossil record, have left this much functional genetic material in modern humans, what are the unnamed ghost populations contributing? What are the immune genes, the metabolic variants, the neural architecture modifications that entered our lineage through encounters with people we have never identified, have never found bones for, and have only glimpsed as statistical shadows in the genomes of their modern descendants? Those questions do not yet have answers. The tools to answer them are being developed right now. The picture they are beginning to paint is of a human past so complex, so layered, so densely interconnected that the word evolution barely covers it. Human evolution was not a single stream. It was not a line. It was an enormously complex network of populations, spreading and contracting and isolating and reconnecting across hundreds of thousands of years in Africa, across Eurasia, through the islands of Southeast Asia, across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, with interbreeding events happening at every junction where different lineages met, each event depositing genetic material that would be carried forward through time in the bodies of the living. Some of those populations were named and known, others left only the faintest shadows in the data. All of them contributed to what we are. All of them survive in partial form in the cells of the people alive today. The discovery that shakes people most deeply when they really confront it is not the Neanderthal connection, which has had time to settle into the cultural consciousness. It is the ghost populations. Because the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, once their existence was confirmed, could be integrated into a revised story of human evolution. Two branches of the human family tree that lived alongside our ancestors, interbred with them, and eventually disappeared while leaving. Genetic traces in the survivors. They had faces, eventually. They had bones. They had a place in the family tree, even if that place required redrawing the tree itself. But the ghost populations have none of that. They are present in our DNA and absent from every other form of evidence. They lived and died and interbred with our ancestors, and left no tools we can identify, no bones we have found, no cave art, no trace in the archaeological record. They are the past that exists only inside us, encoded in sequences that our cells faithfully copy every time they divide, carrying forward the memory of encounters that happened in a world so different from ours that it requires genuine imaginative effort to picture. These are not ancient relatives safely contained in a museum case or an evolutionary diagram. They are biological presences in the bodies of living people. When a child in Papua New Guinea carries Denisovan immune genes that help protect them against a local pathogen, that child is the living continuation of a lineage that includes human beings who have no name in any scientific taxonomy and no representation in any fossil collection. When a West African carries the DNA of a ghost, population that diverged from our ancestors before Neanderthals existed, that person is the walking, breathing archive of a chapter of human history that no one has yet read. The genome is not just a blueprint for a body. It is a historical document of extraordinary depth and complexity, written in a language that science is only now learning to interpret, encoding the record of encounters and inheritances that stretch back further than most people have ever been asked to imagine. Joan Teixeira said it precisely when he described the results of his analysis of ghost populations in Southeast Asian DNA. Each of us carries within ourselves the genetic traces of these past mixing events. Their story is an integral part of how we came to be. That is not a metaphor. It is a molecular fact. The unknown humans in our DNA are not strangers. They are, in the deepest biological sense, part of us. They have been part of us for longer than our species has existed in its current form. And the more carefully we look at what they left inside us, the more we realize that the story of what it means to be human is far older, far stranger, and far less finished than we ever imagined.